This morning, something landed on my desk that made me pause. A copy of the original 2020 CUSMA text, specifically Chapter 34, Article 6. 7 days from now, 3 nations are legally obligated to look each other in the eye and state whether North America's integrated economic engine survives. Yesterday, Donald Trump stood in front of reporters at the G7 summit in France and delivered the most consequential rhetorical broadside to Canadian trade security in a generation. He told the assembled press he would rather see the agreement terminated entirely. Not renegotiated, not patched up, but dead. Mark Carney's immediate response from Ottawa was to shrug it off, telling reporters it is no secret the American president never liked the agreement in the first place. That single, tense exchange tells you everything about the public theatre of global diplomacy and absolutely nothing about the hidden architecture shifting beneath our feet. What most mainstream coverage of this story keeps getting completely backwards is the nature of the date itself. July 1st, 2026 is not a financial cliff. It is not an automatic kill switch. It is a highly structured contractual checkpoint buried deep within the fine print of the treaty. Over the next several minutes, we are going to dissect the hidden mechanics of this review, reveal why Trump's preferred outcome is functionally identical to the gridlock everyone is panicking about, and explain why Canada's actual strategic play right now is to do something that looks an awful lot like nothing at all. Make sure you are subscribed to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis, and hit that like button as we pull back the curtain on this chessboard to understand why Ottawa is not rushing to emergency meetings. You have to look past the political theatre and examine the structural timelines of the treaty itself. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, which shields roughly 1.3 trillion Canadian dollars in annual trilateral commerce, took effect 6 years ago. Under its unique sunset clause, the 3 nations must participate in a joint review at the 6-year mark. Here is the exact timeline to keep things clear. On July 1st, the 3 trade ministers will meet virtually. They have precisely 3 legal options under the text. First, they can unanimously agree to extend the deal for a fresh 16-year term. Second, they can enter a state of formal non-extension, which automatically triggers a 10-year countdown filled with mandatory annual reviews. Third, any single nation can issue a formal 6-month written notice of complete withdrawal. Notice the massive structural gap between what is said on television and what is written in law. There is no scenario where the agreement vanishes next week. Even if Washington formally refuses to extend the treaty, the existing tariff protections remain fully active, and the supply chains keep crossing the border. What changes is not the legal validity of the deal, but the psychological landscape of North American business. Instead of locking in a decade and a half of predictable investment stability, the continent enters a grinding, hyper-politicized cycle of annual negotiations. This detail is completely lost in the media noise, but it matters immensely to Canadian sovereignty because it alters who holds the leverage. This brings us to the core contradiction driving the American camp, where a deep rift has formed between the president's rhetoric and his trade officers' behaviour. Trump wants leverage, and shouting the word termination is the most effective way to manufacture fear without spending a single dime of political capital. In the Oval Office on June 10th and again in France last week, he made his preference clear, stating that the United States does better when it is not bound by multilateral constraints. That is the public stance designed to rattle markets and force concessions. But look at the actual policy track underneath him. United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has quietly told congressional committees that the underlying structure of CUSMA is sound and must be preserved. While Trump threatens to burn the table down, Greer's office has been busy working at it, running 2 full rounds of intense bilateral negotiations with Mexico since March. Washington is not preparing a withdrawal. It is executing a highly sequenced pressure campaign to alter specific rules of origin, raise regional content thresholds for electric vehicles, and capture a larger percentage of automotive manufacturing for the American domestic market. Furthermore, Trump is facing massive countervailing pressure from his own economic base. During House Agriculture Committee hearings earlier this month, Representatives from the American farm sector warned explicitly that scrapping CUSMA would devastate Midwestern agricultural exports. The legal architecture underpins a deeply integrated continental supply chain where 94% of certain automotive components cross northern and southern borders multiple times before final assembly. Trump's political instinct is to threaten absolute termination as a weapon. But his own trade bureaucracy and corporate donors are working overtime to ensure that weapon remains safely holstered. Canada's response to this pressure has been a masterclass in strategic deceleration. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc formally sent Canada's opening position to Washington and Mexico City weeks ago, stating clearly that Ottawa supports a clean, unanimous 16-year renewal. That is the official policy. But underneath that letter, Canada's actual physical posture on the ground has been almost defiantly unhurried. While Washington and Mexico City have already logged months of bilateral sessions, Canada had not entered a single formal, multi-day bilateral negotiating round with Greer's office as of early June. LeBlanc has held brief phone calls. There was a single 45-minute meeting in Washington, and short pull-aside conversations occurred at the G7, but Ottawa is deliberately refusing to match Mexico's frantic pace. Mark Carney has defended this gap by pointing out a critical piece of data. The United States has filed nearly 60 distinct trade irritants against Mexico, which is more than double the number of grievances levelled against Canada. Fewer grievances means less text to formally process, but there is a deeper, unstated strategic calculation at play. Canada is actively resisting the American preference to split the trade bloc into two separate, asymmetric bilateral negotiations, where Washington can use its massive economic weight to crush each smaller partner individually. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum let the secret slip 2 days ago, confirming to reporters that Ottawa and Mexico City have quietly formed a coordinated common front to force the United States to keep the process strictly trilateral. By aligning their asks behind the scenes, the two smaller economies are attempting to recreate the collective leverage they lose when standing alone. What Canada is explicitly not doing is altering its domestic red lines to placate American lawmakers. LeBlanc has reiterated that Canada's supply management system for dairy and its cultural protection rules for French-language content are entirely non-negotiable. This is no longer just a diplomatic talking point. It is a hard legal constraint. Parliament passed explicit legislation last year, making it illegal for Canadian negotiators to concede any further dairy quota access in future trade deals. This structural stubbornness comes at a time when the domestic economy is facing severe headwinds. Having slipped into a technical recession earlier this year, a macroeconomic vulnerability that Trump publicly mocked by posting 51st State on social media. This is the volatile atmosphere surrounding the upcoming July 1st meeting. It is not a routine technical review between friendly neighbours. It is a high-stakes standoff occurring against a backdrop of intense tariff fatigue, where Canada is already enduring separate, punitive American sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber that sit completely outside the CUSMA framework. Carney has openly acknowledged that the spirit of continental free trade has been severely damaged by these targeted American actions, even as Canada requests the treaty's renewal. Securing long-term immunity from these separate sectoral tariffs, while preventing the erosion of existing agricultural protections, is the true, central objective driving Ottawa's strategy. As we look toward the virtual trilateral meeting 7 days from now, the illusion of a sudden, dramatic July 1st collapse disappears. Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, has already confirmed that next week's session is merely a formal opening move, where all three sides will lay their official positions on the table, with subsequent rounds already locked in for late July. The system will not shut off next week. Instead, the continent is highly likely to slide directly into the non-extension track, bypassing a clean 16-year renewal and entering the grueling cycle of annual reviews. This means the critical protections holding $1.3 trillion of trade secure will remain standing, but the underlying geopolitical friction will be re-examined, re-argued, and weaponized every single year for the next decade. Carney is betting that calm, defensive patience can outlast American volatility. Trump is betting that constant, systemic uncertainty will eventually force Canada to break its own domestic laws and surrender its economic sovereignty. Both strategies will face their ultimate test when the clock strikes midnight on July 1st, and neither side shows any intention of flinching. The legal battle lines are drawn, the corporate lobbies are scrambling, and the continental trade regime is about to enter its most volatile chapter since 1994. But as the three ministers prepare to log on to that virtual meeting, the most consequential question remains completely unanswered. To answer that question, we have to look past the political posturing and dismantle the actual legal machinery of CUSMA's Article 34.6. This is where the abstract threats of a trade war collide with cold, binding contractual text. Mainstream analysis treats this review as a single, uniform negotiation, but the structural architecture of the agreement reveals a far more complex, multi-layered apparatus designed to operate on two distinct levels: the high-profile trilateral framework and the deeply combative bilateral tracks running parallel underneath it. To understand how Canada intends to survive this process without surrendering its core economic pillars, we must dissect the three primary components of the deal's architecture that will dictate every move made by Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City over the next 12 months. First, consider the structural mechanics of the joint review mandate itself. Unlike traditional free trade agreements that remain in force indefinitely until a member explicitly withdraws, CUSMA was intentionally engineered with a 16-year lifespan coupled with a mandatory 6-year review cycle. This structural configuration means that on July 1st, the agreement does not automatically renew. If all three countries do not formally confirm in writing their desire to extend the agreement for an additional 16 years, a rolling 10-year countdown clock immediately begins. Once that clock is activated, the agreement remains fully operational under its existing terms. But the three nations are legally compelled to conduct an intensive joint review every single year for the remainder of the decade. At any point during these annual reviews, if unanimous agreement is reached, the 16-year term is restored, resetting the clock. This design features a powerful psychological mechanism. It replaces structural certainty with a permanent state of rolling instability, intentionally engineered by American architects to ensure that smaller trading partners remain permanently compliant or risk facing an escalating series of systemic shocks. Second, we must examine the shifting balance of power within the key personnel directing this confrontation. While Donald Trump commands the media spotlight, the operational levers are controlled by United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, a seasoned trade lawyer who served as Chief of Staff during the negotiation of the original 2020 text. Greer is not an ideological isolationist looking to decouple the North American economy. He is a structural protectionist who views the agreement as an incomplete tool that failed to repatriate enough manufacturing capacity to the American Rust Belt. Standing opposite him is Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, backed by the strategic oversight of Mark Carney, who are operating under a strict domestic mandate. Unlike the 2018 negotiations where Canada was forced onto the defensive by a sudden, chaotic renegotiation, Ottawa's current team is relying on a highly technical, bureaucratic defensive posture designed to exhaust American momentum by strictly adhering to the literal text of the treaty. Meanwhile, Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, represents a highly organized, aggressive negotiating front that has already spent months processing 40 separate technical working groups, leaving Canada as the final unresolved variable on Greer's desk. Third, look at the precise financial and sector-specific friction points that comprise the actual targets of Washington's offensive. The true battlefield is not a wholesale tariff on all goods, but a surgical strike against three highly integrated sectors that represent the lifeblood of Canadian export revenue: automotive rules of origin, supplier-managed agriculture, and digital service taxation. In the automotive sector, the current agreement dictates that 75% of a vehicle's components must originate within North America to qualify for duty-free status, alongside a mandate that 40% to 45% of the labour must be performed by workers earning at least $16 an hour. Greer's office is explicitly pushing to raise that regional value content threshold even higher, while concurrently tightening the tracking mechanisms for subcomponents, effectively attempting to shut down the backdoor entry of Chinese steel and critical minerals routed through Mexican and Canadian supply chains. This is a direct assault on the continent's integrated manufacturing matrix, where a single automotive part frequently crosses a North American border up to 6 times before final assembly, meaning even a fractional adjustment to these percentages threatens to disrupt billions of dollars in capital investments. This granular technical reality explains why the official narrative of an explosive July 1st collapse is fundamentally flawed. That is the public leverage play. But here is the other half of the strategy that most coverage completely misses. Washington's true objective in forcing the treaty into the annual review track is to create a permanent legislative vise. By keeping Canada in a perpetual state of renegotiation, the United States effectively suppresses long-term capital investment in Canadian manufacturing. International conglomerates looking to build next-generation production facilities require 20 to 30 years of regulatory predictability. By reducing that predictability to a rolling 12-month window, the United States makes itself the only safe harbor for manufacturing investments in North America. This is a deliberate, sequenced economic operation disguised as a standard bureaucratic review. The numbers ground this reality with brutal clarity. Canada currently directs roughly 78% of its total merchandise exports straight to the American market, a trade flow valued at more than 400 billion Canadian dollars annually. Under the current CUSMA protections, nearly 90% of those exports enter the United States entirely duty-free. For a middle power like Canada, maintaining the integrity of this legal architecture is not a policy preference. It is an existential macroeconomic necessity. Yet, the strategic alignment has already begun to shift. While Ottawa clings to the defense of the existing text, Washington has already systematically deployed external sectoral tariffs outside of the agreement to weaken Canada's negotiating hand before the formal trilateral talks even begin. This brings us directly to the core tension underlying Canada's defense strategy. Ottawa is currently attempting to execute a dual-track policy that borders on a diplomatic paradox, requesting a full 16-year extension of a treaty while simultaneously declaring that the treaty has been rendered functionally ineffective by unilateral American behaviour. Mark Carney's public assertions that the Continental Trading Framework is effectively broken under the weight of active American tariffs on Canadian steel and softwood lumber reveal the deep systemic strain within the Canadian camp. Ottawa's unhurried, almost static posture is a calculated gamble that the deep integration of the American corporate and agricultural sectors will ultimately act as a natural brake on Trump's protectionist impulses. But this strategy relies entirely on the assumption that economic logic will prevail over political ideology in Washington, a dangerous assumption when dealing with an administration that views trade deficits not as economic metrics, but as geopolitical losses scored to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we continue to track these covert economic shifts. Because what happens on July 1st is merely the procedural opening salvo of a much larger structural transformation. By refusing to engage in early, frantic bilateral concessions, Canada has successfully avoided falling into the asymmetric trap that Washington set for Mexico. But in doing so, Ottawa has locked itself into a legal corner, bound by domestic laws that forbid any concessions on dairy quotas, while facing an American trade apparatus that has spent 6 years preparing to dismantle those exact protections. The chess pieces are now locked into their initial positions, the legal mechanisms of Article 34.6 are officially engaged, and the countdown to the virtual summit is ticking away. The immediate survival of the deal passed next week is legally guaranteed, but the long-term stability of the Canadian economy has never been more fragile. And as both sides prepare to state their intentions to the world, the most volatile structural vulnerability in Canada's economic armour remains completely exposed. The legal mechanisms of CUSMA's sunset clause prove that July 1st is not an end, but an escalation into a permanent cycle of annual reviews designed to extract major concessions from Canada's automotive, dairy and digital sectors. By strategically decelerating its response and building a silent common front with Mexico, Ottawa is playing a dangerous game of bureaucratic chicken, gambling that continental supply chains are too deeply integrated for Washington to actually tear apart. But as we step back from the technical fine print of Article 34.6, the true scope of this crisis comes into focus. This is no longer just a dispute over auto parts and milk quotas. This is a fundamental, structural rewriting of the terms of Canadian sovereignty and our position on the global stage for nearly 3/4 of a century. The Canada-United States relationship operated under a predictable, institutionalized consensus. In the pre-Trump era, trade negotiations were handled by permanent civil servants, operating under the shared assumption that continental integration was an absolute mutual good. Disputes over softwood lumber or steel were treated as minor friction points within an otherwise unbreakable alliance. That era is dead. Washington has fundamentally decoupled its trade policy from traditional diplomatic norms, shifting from a rules-based framework to a transactional mercantilist model where economic interdependence is viewed not as a bond of friendship, but as a strategic vulnerability to be exploited. When an American president comfortably uses the rhetoric of border renegotiation and annexation alongside trade talks, it signals that the geographical and political safety Canada took for granted for a century has dissolved. This structural shift carries massive, destabilizing implications for global alliances and Canada's broader geopolitical orientation. Historically, Ottawa relied on its unrestricted access to the American market to fund its domestic social architecture and assert its status as a reliable middle power. Today, that economic foundation is under constant assault, forcing a profound national reassessment. If the United States permanently weaponizes trade uncertainty through a rolling annual review process, Canada will be driven by sheer necessity to accelerate its trade diversification strategy, looking far beyond North America to secure its economic survival. This means aggressively deepening ties with the European Union, expanding the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and securing critical mineral corridors with democratic allies in Asia. But diversification cannot happen overnight. Rebuilding supply chains takes decades, and Canada is being forced to execute this pivot under the immediate pressure of a technical recession and active sectoral tariffs. Furthermore, this crisis is fundamentally transforming how Canada must approach its national defence and energy security. Washington is no longer separating economic concessions from security obligations. The Trump administration has made it clear that continental trade privileges are directly contingent on Canada meeting its NATO defence spending targets, securing its northern Arctic borders, and shutting down foreign adversarial investments in our critical infrastructure. Our energy sector, which currently pumps close to 4 million barrels of oil per day into American refineries, is being pulled directly onto the chessboard. While Canada views its energy exports as a vital contribution to American energy security, Washington increasingly views it as a leverage point, demonstrating a willingness to impose sweeping tariffs on Canadian energy products to force compliance on completely unrelated political issues. The historical boundary separating commerce from continental defence has been completely erased. www.cacis.org, Gisho 1. We are entering an era where the illusion of a quiet, stable border is gone for good. This is not a temporary political storm that Canada can simply wait out. It is a permanent transformation in the geometry of North American power. The defensive tactics of the past, appealing to international law, relying on corporate lobbying, and expecting historical gratitude, are entirely obsolete against a neighbour that views international law as an obstacle and trade agreements as leverage traps. Ottawa's willingness to stand firm on its domestic red lines will be tested not just in the upcoming virtual summit, but in the grueling, consecutive annual reviews that will define the next decade of our national life. Subs to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis as we document this historic pivot in Canadian history. And make sure to hit that like button to support independent strategic commentary. The immediate theatre of July 1st will soon transition into a structural war of attrition, where every percentage of regional content and every quota allocation becomes a battleground for our economic independence. The initial procedural markers are set, the trilateral common fronts have been formed, and the legal machinery of Kuzma has been officially triggered. But as the continent prepares for a decade of rolling economic instability, the ultimate decision point that will determine whether Canada remains a sovereign economic power or slips permanently into a state of satellite dependence looms immediately on the horizon.